I've always been drawn to strange, old things. Books, maps, artifacts with secrets trapped inside them, as if each object holds a piece of someone's soul. It feels like a calling, like these relics are waiting for me, calling out from dusty shelves and forgotten corners. They have this pull, a silent lure that I can't resist. So when I found that map in the back corner of an old bookstore, half buried under a pile of ancient, neglected papers, I figured it was just another one of those curious little finds. Just another mystery waiting for me. Nothing more. The bookstore itself had a dark, eerie charm. The place was cold and smelled like damp paper and mildew. The ceiling lights flickered, casting strange shadows across the room. The air felt thick, stale, as if it hadn't been disturbed in decades. I should have felt like turning around and leaving, but I kept going as if something was drawing me deeper inside. The map was stuffed in between pages of a dusty, leather-bound book with no title. It looked old, too old. The edges were frayed, worn down to the point of looking almost brittle, and the whole thing was tinted in a sickly yellow, like it had been soaked in something foul. The lines and shapes on it seemed hand-drawn, darkened with age, almost like the ink had bled into the paper over time. I turned it over in my hands, noticing tiny markings across the surface, delicate but unmistakable. The ink was dark and slightly raised, as if the map had been etched rather than just drawn. There were intricate symbols, lines tracing into strange paths that twisted and turned, creating shapes I didn't recognize. And oddly, I could almost swear the map was warm to the touch, like it had a faint pulse under my fingertips. A heartbeat, barely there, but unmistakable. As I stared, the bookstore seemed to fall away. Everything became silent, as if I'd been sucked into some sort of void, just me and the map. My heart pounded, echoing in the silence, and I could feel my pulse in my hands, my fingers tightening around the paper. I knew it was strange, unsettling even, but I couldn't put it down. Without thinking twice, I bought it. The cashier didn't even look at me as I paid. His eyes stayed fixed on the counter, his fingers shaking slightly as he handed me my change. It was like he knew something I didn't, like he was afraid of what I'd just taken into my hands. When I got home that night, I set the map on my kitchen table, unable to shake the feeling that it was watching me somehow, that it knew me. The lights in my apartment flickered as I unfolded it, casting strange, long shadows that seemed to creep across the walls. I looked closer, feeling the rough, waxy texture of the paper, the unevenness of the lines and symbols. It felt too alive, like something that had come from another world. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I began to make out names scattered across the surface, each one carefully written in tiny, spidery letters. Next to each name was a date and a time. My hands started shaking, but I forced myself to look closer, thinking maybe it was just some kind of artwork, a strange piece of someone's imagination. But something about it gnawed at me, an instinct deep in my gut, warning me to put it down, to burn it, to never look at it again. But I couldn't. I decided to start with the first name I saw, James Turner. Beside his name was a date from just a few days ago and a time that seemed oddly specific. It was almost 2:47 p.m., like a watch frozen in the middle of its last heartbeat. The location marked next to it was a spot I knew, a street in the heart of the city, a place I'd passed by 100 times. I opened my laptop, typed in his name, and hit search. As the page loaded, a news article popped up. My heart skipped. There, in black and white, was the obituary for James Turner. He died just days ago, exactly at 2:47 p.m., right where the map had marked. My stomach twisted, and I could feel a cold sweat forming on my brow. I didn't want to look up any more names, but a part of me had to. I was scared, but I needed to know. So with a shaking hand, I searched the next name, and then the one after that. Each name I searched, every single one, led me to the same horrifying discovery. They were all real people, and they were all dead. The room seemed to close in around me, the air thick and heavy, pressing down on my chest. My hands were clammy, my mouth dry. My heart hammered as if trying to break free from my chest. Every part of me screamed to stop looking, to shut my laptop and walk away, but I couldn't. I was trapped by this sick sense of curiosity, a morbid fascination that only deepened as I scrolled through the names. Each name, each date and time, matched perfectly with an obituary, a police report, a missing persons notice. Every name on that map was linked to a real, breathing person who was no longer breathing. Then I noticed it. At the very bottom of the map, where the paper was darkest and most worn, a name I'd overlooked before. It was mine, my own name, inked in that same spidery handwriting. I felt the blood drain from my face as my eyes focused on the words beside it, my home address, and next to it, a date, exactly 1 week from today. I stared at it, my head spinning, my thoughts in a twisted spiral. I wanted to laugh, to dismiss it as some kind of sick joke, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the dread building in my gut. It felt like ice pooling in my stomach, sinking lower and lower, until I felt rooted to the spot. There was no logic to this, no reason for it to be real, but the facts were staring me right in the face. Somehow, this map knew. It knew about those deaths, and now somehow, it knew about mine. I could feel the walls of my apartment pressing in, shadows stretching across the room like reaching fingers. The silence grew louder, the ticking of the clock like a countdown, each second hammering into me. I sat there, paralyzed, staring at that brittle piece of paper. The words, the date, my name. They stared back, unmoving, unchanging. And in that moment, I felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. The days that followed were a waking nightmare. That map, it became all I could think about, a dark shadow creeping into every corner of my mind. No matter what I was doing, I'd find myself drifting back to it, seeing it in my mind's eye, every line, every name, every doomed date and time etched into my memory. The dread it filled me with was suffocating. I tried hiding it, shoving it into a drawer, but it was like I could feel it from across the room, a dark presence pressing on my thoughts. I would catch myself glancing toward the drawer, half expecting to see it creeping out, ready to latch onto me again. When I wasn't looking directly at it, it felt like it was watching me, like it was waiting for me to let my guard down. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see my name written in that strange spidery ink, with my address and the date. I'd see the map, with its frayed edges and dark symbols, hovering like a ghost in the back of my mind. I'd feel my own name staring back at me, like a cold grip tightening around my neck. Each night I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, counting the hours until that date would arrive. My own death felt like it was already crawling toward me, slow but inevitable. By the third night, I couldn't take it anymore. Desperation overtook my fear. I pulled the map out, threw it on the kitchen counter, and grabbed a box of matches. I struck one, watching as the flame flickered and danced in the dark room. My hands shook as I held it to the corner of the map, watching as the paper began to curl, tiny embers eating away at the edges. For a brief, dizzying moment, I thought it might actually work, but then the flames just stopped. They didn't die out, they simply vanished, as if they'd been swallowed whole. I held the match closer, tried again and again, but the map sat there, untouched, unscathed. It felt as though it was mocking me, challenging me to try harder, to break myself in an attempt to destroy it. My frustration turned to panic. I grabbed the map with both hands, desperate to tear it to pieces. I ripped it down the middle, and the sound was so satisfying, so sharp and final, that for a second I felt a strange, foolish relief. But as soon as I looked away, just for a moment, the pieces seemed to melt back together, the paper whole again, as if nothing had happened. I felt trapped, helpless, as if the map had become some kind of twisted lifeline between me and whatever dark fate it had planned. It followed me wherever I went, and each time I tried to turn away from it, I'd see my name again, written there, unchanging. Every day that passed brought me closer to the date marked next to it. I couldn't shake the feeling that the map was alive. It seemed to breathe, almost pulsing with an energy that seeped into my skin. It haunted every moment, gnawed at every thought, filling my life with the certainty of doom, that death was waiting for me, just around the corner. My home no longer felt like a safe place. It was as though every corner, every shadow had turned against me. The walls seemed to close in, and every sound, the slightest creak of the floor, a gust of wind outside, felt like a threat, a warning of something terrible creeping closer. I could feel a presence around me, hovering, watching, waiting. I began catching glimpses of things out of the corner of my eye. Shadows that didn't belong, strange shapes lingering in reflections, just barely there before they vanished. I'd see a dark figure standing just beyond the glass, but when I'd look directly, there'd be nothing but my own pale reflection, my own frightened eyes staring back at me. Each night grew longer, more unbearable. My mind raced with thoughts, weaving nightmares even while I was awake. By the fifth day, I couldn't take it anymore. I threw some clothes into a bag, grabbed my car keys, and with a burst of desperation, I threw the cursed map into the trunk. My only thought was to put as much distance between it and me as possible. I had no destination in mind, just anywhere but here. I sped down the empty roads, each mile pulling me farther away from my own name on that map. For the first time in days, I felt a sliver of hope. After hours of driving, I finally stopped in a small, sleepy town miles away from home. I booked a room in a quiet, almost deserted hotel and tried to steady myself. The place was dimly lit, the halls empty, every sound muffled by the thick, musty carpets. I forced myself to breathe, telling myself I'd finally left it behind. But as I opened my bag to unpack, a chill shot through me. Lying right there, right on top of my clothes, was the map. My hands froze, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I knew. I hadn't packed it. I'd tossed it into the trunk, shut the lid, and left it far behind. And yet here it was, waiting for me, as if it had never left my side. With a trembling hand, I picked it up. My eyes darted to my name, which hadn't moved. But beneath it, a new address was scrawled in fresh ink, the address of the hotel I just checked into. My heart dropped, cold dread flooding my veins. It was as though the map was mocking my attempt to escape, as if it were alive, following me, laughing silently as I tried to flee from something inescapable. The clock on the wall seemed to tick more slowly, each second drawn out like a countdown I couldn't escape. The silence grew heavy, pressing down on me. I could feel it, the suffocating sense of something inevitable, creeping closer with every tick of the clock. It was no longer just the map haunting me. It was everything around me, as if the whole world had turned against me. I was no longer sure where to go, where to hide. By this point, I was a shell of my former self, haunted, half-crazed, barely able to function. The fear had hollowed me out, leaving only the desperate need to find some way, any way, to free myself from this nightmare. My last hope was a local historian I'd heard about, a woman with knowledge of the occult. She'd spent decades studying dark artifacts, curses, and folklore. If anyone could explain this map, it would be her. When I walked into her office, she took one look at me and her face shifted. There was a heaviness in her eyes, as if she knew the type of horror I'd come seeking. I laid the map out on her desk, my hands shaking. She put on a pair of thin, wire-rimmed glasses and leaned over it, squinting, tracing her fingers along the lines and symbols. When she reached my name, her face turned pale, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the ink. "This map," she said, her voice low and barely a whisper, "is not just some artifact. It's a trap crafted with dark intent." Her eyes darted to mine, wide and full of fear. "It doesn't predict your death, it causes it." My heart sank, my stomach twisting in knots. What do you mean?" My voice was weak, barely able to get the words out. She hesitated, her fingers still tracing the lines of the map. She took a long, shaky breath. "Maps like this, they were crafted centuries ago. Cults, dark sorcerers, they used them as tools to bind a person's fate, to mark them for death. Once your name appears, it's bound. It won't change. And the more you try to escape, the closer you draw yourself to your own doom." Her words made my blood run cold. It was as if the map itself had a consciousness, a malevolent will that fed on my fear, tightening its hold every time I tried to pull away. I could feel it, like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest, making it harder to breathe. "Isn't there any way to stop it?" I asked, the desperation leaking through my voice. My mind raced with every terrible outcome, every horrific image of what might happen if I stayed trapped by this cursed piece of paper. The historian looked at me with sorrowful eyes. She hesitated, then lowered her gaze. "There is one way," she murmured, her voice heavy, each word laced with dread. "But you won't like it." "What is it?" I asked, bracing myself. She looked back at me, her face grim, almost pitying. "To break the curse, you would have to pass the map on to someone else. The map needs a name. It doesn't care whose. If you give it to another person, if they open it and see their name, the curse will transfer. They'll be marked instead of you." I froze, horror filling every inch of me. The thought was unthinkable. I couldn't knowingly hand this nightmare over to someone else, condemning them to the same fate. The image of my own name burned in my mind, that sick ink marking me, sealing me to some twisted, inevitable end. The historian's gaze held mine, her eyes a mixture of pity and fear. "You'll have to decide," she whispered, "but every moment you keep it, every attempt to escape, brings the end closer." I felt the weight of it settle on me, the terrible choice gnawing at my mind. It was a decision that would haunt me, no matter what I chose. And as I looked down at the map, my name staring back at me from the brittle yellowed paper, I felt the suffocating truth. It was only a matter of time. The historian's face was pale as she handed me a small, worn knife, its blade blackened as if stained by countless rituals before. "There's only one other way," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "A dark ritual, a blood offering. If you carve your name from the map, you might sever its hold on you, but it must be done with unwavering resolve." I hesitated, feeling the cold metal in my hand, the weight of the decision settling over me. This was my last chance, my only hope to free myself from this relentless curse. I swallowed hard, fear mixing with desperation, drowning out all logic. With trembling hands, I brought the knife to the map, its edge hovering over my name, that cursed ink binding me to my fate. As I pressed the blade to the paper, a strange warmth pulsed through it, as if the map were alive, reacting to the touch. My hand remained steady despite the crawling dread that gripped my spine. I dragged the blade along each letter of my name, determined, my breaths shallow and quick. The knife cut deeper, and I felt a strange pull, as though I were carving away part of myself. The map shuddered, almost as if it were in pain. The paper twisted beneath the knife, contorting, the ink swirling like dark, ominous smoke. Then blood began to seep from my fingers, trickling down onto the map, mingling with the ink, staining the ancient lines and symbols. The sharp, metallic scent filled the room as I continued, gritting my teeth, pushing through the searing pain that shot up my arm. Just as I made the final cut, the map went still. The twisted lines stopped writhing, the ink faded, and an unsettling calm settled over the paper. My heart pounded in my chest as I dared to hope, to believe that I had somehow broken the curse. Maybe, just maybe, I was free. But as I leaned closer, dread washed over me. There, at the edge of the map, a new name began to form. The ink bled into the paper, dark and final, each letter spelling out a name I knew all too well. It was the historian's. I turned to her, horror widening my eyes, but she already knew. Her face was ashen, her expression resigned, as if she'd seen this outcome all along. "It always needs a name," she whispered, her voice hollow, filled with a bitter acceptance. "You severed your fate, but it has to claim someone." My mind reeled, the weight of what I had done sinking in. I hadn't broken the curse. I had only passed it on, sealing her fate in my place. I could see it in her eyes, a flicker of sadness, maybe even pity, as though she understood the impossible choice I'd been forced to make. And yet, beneath that, I saw fear, a dawning horror in her gaze as she looked down at the map, her own name inked there like a death sentence. The room grew colder, darker, as if the very air thickened with the curse's lingering presence. I felt a chill crawl over my skin, and in the silence I swore I heard the faintest whisper, like a warning, a reminder that it was never truly over. I left her there, the weight of my actions pressing down on me. The map, now with her name, would haunt her as it had haunted me. As I stepped into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that, no matter how far I ran, no matter where I went, the map and whatever darkness it held wasn't done with me yet. The air was thick with the weight of what I'd just done. I stared at the map, my heart pounding in my chest. I had hoped, naively, that by severing my name from the cursed paper, I would somehow be free. But the truth hit me like a punch to the gut as the historian gasped, her eyes wide with horror. Her name, scrawled in dark ink, appeared on the map, alongside a location and a time, just a few minutes away. The letters seemed to burn into my soul, as though they were a final judgment. She turned slowly to face me, her expression one of pure betrayal. The horror in her eyes cut deeper than any knife ever could. I could see it in her face. She knew. She knew what I had done. She knew that I had passed the curse on to her, that I had traded her life for my own. A chill washed over me like ice flooding my veins. I wanted to speak, to apologize, to explain, but the words caught in my throat. I had been so desperate, so consumed by fear, that I hadn't thought about the consequences. Now I was the one who had cursed her, who had condemned her to the same fate I had tried so desperately to escape. Without another word, she grabbed the map, clutching it to her chest like a lifeline. She ran from the room, her footsteps echoing in the silence, each one growing fainter and fainter until they disappeared completely. I stood frozen, guilt and terror churning inside me, the weight of my actions sinking deeper into my chest. But it didn't end there. No matter how far I tried to run, no matter how much I wished to escape, I couldn't shake the feeling that the curse was still with me, that it was watching, waiting. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified in the dead of night. I could feel it lurking just outside my vision, as though it was biding its time, ready to strike when I least expected it. For weeks, I tried to forget. I tried to live a normal life, to block out the horror that had consumed me. But no matter how far I ran, no matter how many miles I put between myself and the cursed map, it was always there, just beneath the surface. At night, the feeling grew stronger. Sometimes when I lay in bed, trying to sleep, I would catch a glimpse of something moving outside my window, a shadow, just out of reach, like a figure that was never quite there, yet always present. It felt as though it was waiting for me to slip up, to fall asleep, to let my guard down. And then there was the paper. The map had been burned, torn, destroyed, but every time I sat at my desk, I would find it, a blank piece of paper, sitting there quietly, almost mocking me. I would stare at it, my heart in my throat, knowing deep down that it was only a matter of time before my name would return. I could feel it, like a dark presence hovering just beyond the paper, just beyond my reach. No matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape it. The curse had found its way into my life, and it wasn't done with me yet. And every time I looked at that blank sheet of paper, I could almost hear the map whispering to me, calling me back. It was only a matter of time before my name would be written there again. And when that moment came, I would be ready. But part of me knew, deep down, that there was no escape. The curse would never let me go. It had no end. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more chilling tales.